At 0742 hours on the morning of March 6, 1944, Colonel Donald Blakesley sat in the cockpit of his P-51 Mustang at Debden Airfield, England, preparing to lead a mission the Luftwaffe had dismissed as impossible. The destination was Berlin, 560 miles into the core of Nazi Germany. German intelligence had assured their high command that no American single-engine fighter possessed the range to reach Berlin and return. The round trip spanned 1,100 miles. Every American fighter tested. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the P-38 Lightning, ran out of fuel hundreds of miles short of the German capital. Luftwaffe pilots knew this well. They waited just beyond the known fighter range, then attacked the unprotected bombers with devastating effect. American bomber losses over Germany had reached unbearable levels. In October 1943 alone, 60 B-17 flying fortresses were destroyed in one mission to Schweinfurt, 20% of the attacking force. The daylight bombing campaign was collapsing. But on this morning, Blakesley's P-51 carried something the Germans believed could not exist. Beneath each wing hung a 108-gallon paper drop tank, manufactured in Britain, giving his Mustang a combat radius of 850 miles. Combined with the 85-gallon fuselage tank and wing tanks, the aircraft carried enough fuel to reach Berlin, fight for 20 minutes, and fly home. German intelligence had calculated such range was impossible. Their pilots had been briefed they would never encounter enemy fighters over the Reich's capital. They were about to be proven wrong. Blakesley, aged 26, had been battling the Luftwaffe since 1941, first with the RAF's Eagle Squadron, then with the U.S. Army Air Force's 4th Fighter Group, with over 500 combat missions flown. More than any other American pilot in the war, he understood the brutal cost of unescorted bombers. Too many B-17 seconds had been torn apart because their escorts had to turn back for lack of fuel. Now, for the first time, he was leading single-engine fighters all the way to Berlin, a mission that would, in 7 hours, alter the balance of the air war in Europe. The first bomber crew, the 4th Fighter Group had lost due to escort limitations, was Lieutenant. 30 seconds later, German fighters struck. O'Connor's crew reported attacks from 15 to 20 interceptors and called for help that never came. His aircraft was hit repeatedly by 20mm cannon fire. The right-wing tank exploded, and the bomber rolled inverted, diving from 22,000 feet. No parachutes were seen. All 10 men perished. By October 1943, the 8th Air Force had lost 194 heavy bombers in just 3 months, most beyond escort range. The crews called it going naked, flying without cover. German pilots called it happy hunting time. They knew precisely where American escorts turned back and waited there in force. The B-17's defensive 50-caliber guns couldn't stop skilled German aces attacking head-on at 400 miles per hour. Losses exceeded replacement rates. The worst disaster came on October 14, 1943. The second Schweinfurt raid of 320 bombers. 60 were shot down, 600 airmen killed or captured, 17 more aircraft scrapped, and another 100 badly damaged. Losses reached 29%. General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces, halted deep penetration raids. Without long-range fighter escort, the daylight offensive was doomed, and without it, the coming invasion of Europe might fail. The Luftwaffe would remain strong, extending the war and raising Allied casualties. The issue wasn't bomber range. B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds could hit any target in Germany. It was survival. The P-47 Thunderbolt's 230-mile combat radius, 375 with drop tanks, reached only Western Germany. The P-38 Lightning could go about 450 miles, but suffered mechanical failures in Europe's freezing high altitudes, with both engines often quitting, a problem pilots called getting P-38. The RAF's Spitfire had superb agility, but insufficient range, barely reaching Paris. Then came the breakthrough. On December 20, 1943, the 354th Fighter Group arrived in England with the P-51 Mustang, an aircraft developed through innovation and desperation. In 1940, Britain had asked North American Aviation to build P-42s under license. Instead, company president James Kindleberger proposed designing an all-new fighter from scratch. Incredibly, chief designer Edgar Schmude and his team produced a prototype in just 117 days. The first Mustang flew in October 1940, designated NA-73 by the company and Mustang by the RAF. Early Mustangs used Allison engines, excellent at low altitude but weak above 15,000 feet, unsuitable for high-altitude bomber escort. They served in ground attack and reconnaissance roles. But in April 1942, Rolls-Royce test pilot Ronald Harker flew a Mustang and immediately recognized its potential. The airframe was outstanding, sleek, stable, and long-ranged, but the engine was wrong. Harker suggested fitting the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine with its two-stage supercharger capable of maintaining power up to 30,000 feet. The British converted 5 Mustangs with Merlin 61 engines, and the results were extraordinary. Top speed rose from 365 to 441 miles per hour. Climb rate and ceiling dramatically improved, and suddenly the Mustang could match or exceed Germany's best fighters. North American began production of the Merlin-powered P-51 Billions and P-51C models in 1943, using Packard-built V1650 engines. The design was simple yet revolutionary. Large internal fuel capacity, 184 gallons with the fuselage tank, and external drop tanks giving a total of 400 gallons. The P-51 Billions could reach 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, climb to 30,000 in 8 minutes, outturn a Bf-109, dive with an FW-190, and most importantly, fly for more than 6 hours. Its combat radius with full tanks reached 850 miles, enough to escort bombers all the way to Berlin, fight there, and bring its pilots safely home. That was enough. Finally enough to reach Berlin. But the extra fuel brought a new problem. The P-51 Billions fuselage tank sat behind the pilot, aft of the center of gravity. When fully topped with 85 gallons, the airplane became dangerously nose-light in pitch. Test pilots reported that with the fuselage tank full, violent pullouts or hard turns could make the stick forces reverse. The pilot had to push forward on the stick to stop the nose from climbing further. With a full fuselage tank, the Mustang tended to want to tumble. A P-51 Billions could not be used in a dogfight while the tank remained full. It was barely maneuverable. The fix was simple in concept, but demanding in practice. Burn the fuselage fuel first before engaging the enemy. Pilots were ordered to use the fuselage tank during climb out and cruise so the airplane would be properly balanced by the time it reached hostile airspace. Only when the fuselage tank was empty, or nearly so, did the center of gravity shift forward and handling return to normal, which required disciplined fuel management. Pilots had to monitor consumption constantly, switch tanks at the correct times, compute range to the target, allowance for fighting time, and fuel needed to get home. One error, and they could run out of fuel over Germany. The 354th Fighter Group flew its first escort missions in Mustangs on December 5, 1943, to Amiens, then to Minden on December 11th, and to Kiel on December 13th. The Kiel sortie reached about 480 miles into Germany, the deepest penetration by an American single-engine fighter to that date. The Luftwaffe reacted, scrambling more than 200 fighters to intercept. The 354th shot down 8 German aircraft and suffered no losses. The Mustang worked. It could penetrate deep into the Reich, fight, and return. Major General Jimmy Doolittle, who assumed command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, saw the aircraft's potential. At once, he needed them, dozens, then hundreds. The success of the strategic bombing campaign depended on destroying the Luftwaffe's fighters, and the only way to force that fight was to strike targets the Germans had to defend, deep targets like Berlin. But to reach Berlin and provide continuous escort, he needed long-range fighters, P-51 seconds. Doolittle began converting groups from P-47 seconds to P-51 seconds as quickly as production allowed. The 4th Fighter Group was next. Colonel Donald Blakesley, assigned to the 354th in December to help with their combat conversion, returned to the 4th in January as group commander and pushed to have Mustangs issued to his men. Major General William Kepner, commander of the 8th Fighter Command, hesitated. Converting a group to a new type normally meant pulling the entire unit off operations for weeks, while pilots and ground crews learned the aircraft and its systems. Time Kepner felt he could not spare during the invasion build-up. The operation was approved and first scheduled for March 3rd, but weather scrubbed it. A second try on March 4 produced marginal conditions yet acceptable for a strike. Over 600 bombers launched, escorted by more than 650 fighters, including 48 Mustangs from the 4th. It was the first major American daylight raid on Berlin. Blakesley led his Mustangs. After a 0500 briefing, the plotted track ran northeast across the North Sea, over the Netherlands, across northern Germany and straight to Berlin, where the bombers would hit industrial targets and the fighters would remain with them from takeoff to landing. No bomber would be left unescorted. Forecasts called for scattered clouds over the target with 3 to 5 miles visibility. Heavy German fighter opposition was expected. The Luftwaffe would defend Berlin with everything they could muster. Intelligence briefings had estimated that between 300 and 400 German fighters would be in the air. The American squadrons knew they would be outnumbered once over the target area, yet they would possess an advantage: altitude and positioning. The bombers were to release their loads from 24,000 to 26,000 feet, while the escorting fighters maintained a protective cover at 30,000 feet, situated between the bombers and the sun. Any German aircraft attempting to reach the bombers would be forced to climb directly through that defensive shield. Fuel discipline was crucial. Each pilot had been explicitly ordered to drain his fuselage fuel tank to under 40 gallons before crossing into German territory. When combat loomed, empty drop tanks were to be released immediately. Every pilot bore the responsibility of tracking his own fuel and calculating how much was required to make it home. There would be no rescue for those stranded over enemy territory. Anyone who ran out of fuel over Germany would be on his own. The closest friendly soil lay across more than 200 miles of occupied Europe. In the Netherlands, a Mustang could glide perhaps 30 miles without power. A simple calculation revealed the truth. If a pilot's engine quit over Berlin, he would not return. The 4th Fighter Group took off at 7:42 hours. 48 P-51 Mustangs, each carrying 2 108-gallon drop tanks, fully armed and fueled to the limits of weight and range. The aircraft were heavy and temperamental. Taking off at maximum gross weight required precise control. Too much throttle and torque could pull the fighter off the runway; too little, and the plane might fail to lift off before the airstrip ended. Colonel Blakesley's Mustang lifted after using 3/4 of the runway. He climbed to 1,000 feet, circled once, and watched his 3 squadrons assemble in formation behind him. 48 silver aircraft gleaming against a grey English morning sky. Then they set course across the North Sea. The flight to Germany would take 2.5 hours. The bomber stream was already ahead, a column 70 miles long over 600 heavy bombers carrying thousands of tons of explosives toward the Nazi capital. The 4th Fighter Group rendezvoused with its assigned bomber formation over the Netherlands at 9:15, right on schedule. Blakesley arranged his formation in a combat spread, 5,000 feet above the bombers, weaving gently to maintain position. Blakesley himself fired at a Bf-109 before his guns jammed after 2 seconds. Undeterred, he maneuvered his aircraft aggressively, herding enemy fighters into kill zones for his wingmen. Major James Goodson destroyed 2 FW-192s within moments, while Captain Don Gentile downed a Bf-109 from 200 yards, watching it erupt into fragments. The radio crackled continuously. "Break right, bandit on your 6. Got him, 2 more at 3 o'clock. The fight raged in all directions, vapor trails twisting like ribbons across the sky. Through it all, Blakesley kept discipline. His squadrons held their positions above the bombers, shielding them from attack. Despite the ferocity of the German assault, the Mustangs refused to yield. When their ammunition and fuel ran low, the Luftwaffe pilots broke off, diving away toward their airfields. The 4th Fighter Group had not lost a single aircraft and claimed 5 confirmed kills. More importantly, Every bomber under their escort reached the target intact. Over Berlin, the bombers flew into a storm of flak. Thousands of anti-aircraft guns filled the air with black bursts of shrapnel. The bombers, maintaining formation discipline, opened their bomb bays at 24,000 feet. Below them spread the vast city, grey streets, factories, and the winding Spree River. Thousands of bombs tumbled downward, leaving smoke trails before vanishing into the city below. From 30,000 feet, Blakesley watched the explosions blossom, clouds of smoke rising as Berlin burned beneath them. The bombers turned west for home. Fresh German fighters rose to attack the damaged stragglers. The Mustangs dove to intercept again, defending all the way across Germany and the Netherlands until the formations reached the safety of the North Sea. The mission lasted 6 hours and 40 minutes from takeoff to landing. Blakesley touched down at Debden at 14 hours with only 20 gallons of fuel left, about 10 minutes of flight time. Every aircraft in the 4th Fighter Group returned safely, and none of the bombers they escorted had been shot down. What the Americans didn't realize was that Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring himself had watched the battle from Berlin. From his headquarters, he saw the contrails of American single-engine fighters high above the capital, an image he had believed impossible. His analysts had long insisted that no American fighter could reach Berlin. They had examined captured P-47 seconds and P-38 seconds and concluded that their ranges were far too limited. Göring's own controllers had promised that any deep penetration bomber raid would always be vulnerable once the escorts turned back. They were all wrong. Seeing the P-51 seconds over Berlin, Göring understood instantly. The balance of the air war had shifted. From that moment he knew Germany could no longer hide. American bombers could now strike any target in the Reich under continuous fighter escort. The Luftwaffe would be forced to fight over its own territory, at the end of stretched supply lines, short on fuel, and with inexperienced replacement pilots. Göring later admitted that when he saw those silver fighters above Berlin, he realized Germany had lost control of the air. The Americans returned to Berlin on March 6, 1944, this time 800 bombers escorted by more than 900 fighters. The 4th Fighter Group flew again, Blakesley once more leading his men. But the Luftwaffe had learned from its mistake. It gathered fighters from Italy, from the Eastern Front, from every corner of Europe. Over 350 German aircraft rose to meet the Americans, setting the stage for one of the largest aerial clashes in history, Black Monday. The first engagements occurred 50 miles west of Berlin. The Germans had changed tactics. Instead of rushing the bombers, they focused on breaking up the escort screen. If they could scatter the P-51 seconds, the bombers would be exposed. Wave after wave of Bf-109 seconds and FW-190 seconds plunged through the formations, attempting to tear the escorts apart. The sky filled with aircraft diving, climbing, twisting, a rolling, spinning storm of steel and fire. American pilots fought back fiercely. Major Goodson destroyed 2 more German fighters. Lieutenant Howard Hively engaged multiple opponents across the sector. The fighting spread over hundreds of miles as the 8th Fighter Command battled the Luftwaffe in one of the war's bloodiest air engagements. German records later listed between 66 and 81 aircraft lost that day, though American claims were much higher due to overlapping reports. The US lost 69 bombers and 11 fighters, including 4 from Blakesley's group. Despite the casualties, the mission succeeded. Berlin was bombed again, and the presence of P-51s over the capital was now indisputable. Within 48 hours, the 4th Fighter Group was ordered back to Berlin for a 3rd strike, this time targeting the Erkner ball-bearing works on March 8th. On that mission, Captain Gentile and his wingman Lieutenant John Godfrey employed new aggressive tactics. Gentile destroyed 3 Bf-109 seconds in one engagement, bringing his confirmed total to around 14. Together they downed 6 enemy aircraft that day, proving that the P-51s could not only escort bombers to Berlin, but dominate German fighters in direct combat over the Reich's heart. By mid-March 1944, the situation for the Luftwaffe was deteriorating faster than even its own commanders could comprehend. In a single month, German fighter units lost more than 1/3 of their frontline strength. Entire Gruppen were being wiped out in the skies over Germany. Young replacements, many with fewer than 100 hours of total flight time, were being thrown into combat against veteran American pilots who had hundreds of operational hours and aircraft that could fly higher, faster, and farther. Each new raid over the Reich was accompanied by hundreds of silver fighters, escorting the bombers all the way to the target and back. The Luftwaffe had no answer. German pilots would climb desperately into the cold, thin air, only to find the Mustangs already above them, poised to strike from the sun. What the Luftwaffe pilots could not see was the vast machine behind those American aircraft, the mechanics, armourers, and ground crews who kept the 4th Fighter Group in the air day after day. At Debden, England, the flight line came alive before dawn. Dozens of crew chiefs moved down the rows of Mustangs, flashlights clutched in gloved hands, checking fuel lines, cleaning gun barrels, and topping off oil tanks thickened by the cold night. Every aircraft was stripped, inspected, and rearmed after each mission. Ammunition belts were loaded by hand, 1,260 rounds per fighter, carefully threaded into the gun bays so that each bullet would feed smoothly. Mechanics worked in silence, tools clinking softly under the roar of warming engines. A single mistake could cost a pilot his life. The P-51's Merlin engine was a masterpiece of engineering, but it demanded precision maintenance. Spark plugs fouled easily, coolant lines leaked under stress, even a minor oil pressure fluctuation could lead to engine seizure in combat. The ground crews knew every sound of every engine on the field. When one sputtered or coughed, the chief mechanic could often identify the issue instantly. They worked in mud, in snow, and in freezing rain, sometimes 18 hours straight. When a pilot returned with holes in his wings or half a rudder missing, the mechanics patched it with whatever they had: sheet aluminum, canvas, or even pieces of another wrecked aircraft. There were no spare planes. Every fighter was kept flying, no matter how battered. After each sortie, pilots gathered in the operations hut to debrief. They described the attacks, the altitude, the direction of enemy strikes, the approximate number of aircraft shot down. Intelligence officers compiled the information to identify Luftwaffe tactics and anticipate the next counter-move. The Germans, they noticed, were increasingly launching head-on attacks against bomber formations. A suicidal tactic, but the only way to break through the defensive screens. The Luftwaffe was burning itself out. Fuel shortages had become catastrophic. American raids on refineries and synthetic fuel plants, especially those at Leuna and Politz, had slashed production. Many German squadrons were flying with half their operational aircraft, grounded for lack of aviation gasoline. Some pilots practiced combat maneuvers on bicycles to save fuel. By early April, American airmen could sense that the enemy's strength was ebbing. The German attacks came later, were less coordinated, and ended sooner. When the Luftwaffe did appear, it often consisted of small formations, perhaps a dozen fighters at a time, thrown piecemeal into battle. Yet even cornered, the German pilots remained dangerous. Many were hardened veterans who fought to the death. One such encounter occurred on April 8, 1944, when Blakesley's group escorted bombers to Rhine and Munster. They encountered about 30 Bf 109 seconds. Captain Don Gentile, already one of the 8th Air Force's most famous aces, engaged several of them. In less than 4 minutes, he destroyed 3 enemy aircraft, bringing his official total to over 20 confirmed kills. The following day, Debden celebrated. News correspondents arrived from London to film Gentile's return from another mission. As he taxied in, ground crews cheered and cameras rolled. He grinned, saluted, and, in a burst of exuberance, attempted a low-level victory roll over the airfield. His Mustang struck the ground, disintegrating in a cloud of dust and debris. Gentile crawled from the wreck, dazed but alive. His aircraft was destroyed, and the incident ended his flying career. To the men of the 4th Fighter Group, it was a painful reminder. In combat or celebration, the margin for error was thin. Meanwhile, the bomber offensive pressed deeper into Germany. Leipzig, Brunswick, Munich, and Schweinfurt, all industrial centers, were pounded repeatedly. Every strike drew the Luftwaffe up to fight, and every engagement drained it further. By May, the 8th Air Force was destroying an average of 250 German aircraft per week. American strategists had begun to speak openly of achieving air supremacy, the total destruction of Germany's ability to resist in the sky. Yet they knew the cost. Thousands of bomber crews were dying every month, their aircraft torn apart by flak or intercepted. Before the escorts arrived, the P-51 seconds were their shield, but there were never enough of them to cover every formation. To expand escort range and flexibility, new airfields were established across southern England. Maintenance facilities grew into small cities of tents, workshops, and fuel depots. The supply chain stretched from us, factories to Atlantic convoys, through British ports and finally to muddy airstrips in East Anglia. Each P-51 required dozens of men to keep it airborne. For every pilot who strapped in, there were perhaps 20 others. Armourers, mechanics, electricians, cooks, and clerks working behind him. Blakesley, now a full colonel, watched as his once small fighter group transformed into a complex combat organization. The turnover was relentless. New pilots arrived from America almost weekly, while veterans rotated home after completing their tours. Yet the group maintained its edge. Discipline and camaraderie held it together. By June 1944, preparations for Operation Overlord were underway. Allied commanders demanded absolute air control over northern France before the invasion. The 8th and 9th Air Forces launched a concentrated campaign to destroy the French railway network, bridges, junctions, and marshalling yards. The Luftwaffe tried to resist but could no longer sustain daily combat. When D-Day arrived on June 6, 1944, the skies over Normandy belonged to the Allies. Hundreds of P-51 seconds, P-47 seconds, and P-38 seconds swept over the beaches, strafing German convoys and smashing communication lines. The Luftwaffe made only scattered appearances. Most of its remaining aircraft were destroyed on the ground or stranded without fuel. For the men of the 4th Fighter Group, the change was unmistakable. Missions that had once ended in desperate dogfights were now routine patrols. Some pilots went weeks without seeing an enemy aircraft. The once fearsome Luftwaffe, which had dominated Europe in 1940, had been broken in less than 4 years, and yet the war was far from over. Even as the Allies advanced across France, new threats emerged. The V-1 flying bomb, the V-2 rocket, and desperate counterattacks by the remnants of the German Air Force. The next phase of the air campaign would take the fight deep into the heart of Germany, toward the Rhine, the Ruhr, and ultimately Berlin again. By the late summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe was in free fall. Its veteran ranks were nearly gone, its supply lines shattered, and its fuel reserves on the verge of collapse. The once proud air arm that had terrorized Europe in 1940 now struggled merely to get aircraft off the ground. American dominance in the air was absolute. The P-51 Mustangs, operating in massive formations, roamed across occupied Europe almost unchallenged. They struck airfields, rail lines, and convoys with impunity. The German homeland, once protected by layers of fighters and flak, was now naked beneath an endless stream of silver aircraft. Colonel Donald Blakesley and his men flew mission after mission from Debden, pushing deeper into Germany with each passing week. The group's focus shifted from escort to air superiority, destroying what remained of the Luftwaffe wherever it appeared. In August, the 4th Fighter Group launched a sweep over Leipzig and Magdeburg. What they encountered were not veteran squadrons of experienced aces, but green conscripts, barely trained, flying hastily assembled aircraft. Many of these young pilots never even made visual contact before being shot down. Combat reports from that month told the same story. Enemy disorganized, scattered, destroyed without coordinated resistance. By this stage of the war, the Mustang had become far more than just an escort fighter. Pilots had learned to use its speed and range to attack the Luftwaffe at its source, the airfields themselves. Flights of P-51 seconds would descend at dawn on German bases, strafing rows of parked aircraft and fuel trucks. These airfield sweeps were devastating. A single Mustang could destroy half a dozen planes on the ground in one pass. The Luftwaffe responded with desperation. In September, they launched Operation Bodenplatte, a massive surprise attack on Allied airfields in Western Europe. Hundreds of German fighters took off on New Year's Day, 1945, in a final bid to cripple the Allied air forces on the ground. But intelligence leaks, poor coordination, and worsening weather turned it into disaster. The Luftwaffe destroyed a number of aircraft on the ground, yet lost nearly 300 fighters and most of their remaining veteran pilots. The attack that was meant to revive German air power instead finished it off. From that moment on, the Luftwaffe ceased to exist as a serious fighting force. Meanwhile, the P-51 groups continued their relentless advance eastward. Escort missions now stretched beyond Berlin, into Poland and Czechoslovakia, covering bombers attacking industrial sites, oil refineries and rail yards that fed the remnants of the German army. Fuel depots in Politz, Brux and Blechhammer went up in flames, sending black plumes thousands of feet into the sky. The loss of synthetic fuel production paralyzed the German war machine. Tanks could not move, trucks sat idle. Even the Me-262 jet squadrons, Germany's last hope, were grounded for lack of aviation gasoline. When the Messerschmitt Me-262 finally entered combat in late 1944, its performance stunned Allied pilots. It was faster, climbed higher, and could outrun anything in the sky, but its numbers were too few and its missions too short. The jets were most vulnerable during takeoff and landing, when they were slow and exposed. The Mustangs learned to patrol above jet bases, waiting for the telltale glint of silver wings rising from the runway. As soon as the 262 seconds appeared, the P-51 seconds dove in. A single burst from 650 caliber machine guns could shred the jet before it reached combat speed. The Luftwaffe's revolutionary aircraft never had a chance to turn the tide. In the first months of 1945, the 4th Fighter Group shifted its operations from strategic escort to direct ground attack in support of Allied troops crossing the Rhine. Missions targeted trains, bridges, convoys, and anything that moved behind German lines. The Mustang's role had evolved, from protector of bombers to the scalpel of the air war, cutting deep into the heart of the collapsing Reich. The weather was bitter and the fighting fierce. Pilots flew multiple sorties per day in sleet and snow, often returning to bases covered in mud and ice. Mechanics worked in makeshift shelters, patching bullet holes, replacing engines, and reloading ammunition in near-freezing temperatures. Losses continued, even as victory drew near. Anti-aircraft fire, flak, grew heavier the closer the Allies came to Berlin. Pilots learned to recognize the sharp black bursts by type. Light flak for low-level strafing runs, heavy flak for bomber escort altitudes. Many Mustangs returned riddled with holes. Others never came back, yet the pace never slowed. Between January and April 1945, the 4th Fighter Group flew over 3,000 combat sorties, destroying hundreds of locomotives, vehicles, and enemy aircraft. Their aerial victories, once counted in individual duels, were now tallied by the dozen. When American and Soviet forces finally converged on Berlin in late April, the sky above Germany was an Allied domain. The Luftwaffe's last sorties were flown by boys in their teens, piloting whatever aircraft could still fly. Old trainers, obsolete Bf-109 seconds, even gliders. On May 8, 1945, the war in Europe ended. The surviving pilots of the 4th Fighter Group assembled at Debden for the final roll call. Many of their comrades were gone, lost over France, Holland and Germany, but their mission had succeeded beyond measure. In 18 months, they had destroyed over 1,000 enemy aircraft, achieved air dominance across Western Europe, and cleared the skies for the armies that marched to victory. For the men who had flown and maintained the Mustang, the sight of peace was strange. The familiar roar of engines faded into silence. Hangars once alive with activity stood empty. Ground crews who had once labored through nights in freezing rain now packed their tools and waited for ships home. Colonel Blakesley, who had led his men through the fiercest air battles of the war, stood on the Debden airfield one last time and watched the sun set behind the silent Mustangs. The fight was over. The skies were theirs. Robert Harriman's B-17. On August 17, 1943, Harriman's crew had been in England 2 months and flown 6 missions. Their target was the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, deep in Germany. P-47 Thunderbolts escorted them only as far as the border before fuel forced them home. The Luftwaffe waited patiently, knowing exactly when the escorts would leave. As soon as the Thunderbolts turned back, 300 Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds, and Focke-Wulf 190 seconds swarmed the bombers. Harriman's plane took cannon fire in engine number 3 within 20 minutes. The engine caught fire, the propeller was feathered, but the flames spread. 2 German fighters made a rear attack, riddling the fuselage. The tail snapped off, and the bomber spun down. Only 3 of the 10 crewmen escaped. That mission cost 36 bombers, 260 airmen killed or captured, all beyond escort range. Another was Captain James O'Connor's B-24, lost on September 6th near Stuttgart. A veteran of 14 missions, O'Connor led his formation against the Bosch Magneto plant, P-38 Lightnings, escorted as far as fuel allowed, about 400 miles, then turned back. Blakesley made a bold offer. "Give me the P-51 seconds, and I'll have the 4th combat ready within 24 hours. Kepner thought it insane. Blakesley insisted it was possible. His pilots had flown Spitfires with the RAF and new Merlin-powered engines. His ground crews had years of Merlin experience and could maintain the Packard-built V-1650 seconds. Kepner agreed on one hard condition. If the 4th was not fully operational within 24 hours, Blakesley would be removed. The 4th received its first P-51 BS on February 26, 1944. Blakesley told his pilots to learn to fly them on the way to the target. They would begin combat within 48 hours. Some pilots logged under 30 minutes in the Mustang before their first mission. Mechanics worked through nights, studying systems, loading guns, and fitting drop tanks. By February 28, the 4th flew its first P-51 escort to France. Every airplane returned. Blakesley had delivered. By early March 1944, the 8th had sufficient Mustangs to attempt what had been unthinkable 6 months earlier, a daylight raid on Berlin with fighter escort, all the way in and back. Below them, the bomber formations held steady, tight and disciplined, engines droning as the Dutch countryside of fields, rivers and small towns slipped beneath them. At 9:35, the formation crossed into Germany. Contrails soon appeared ahead, white lines against the blue, German fighters climbing to intercept. Blakesley counted at least 40, perhaps 50, with more joining every minute. The Luftwaffe had scrambled everything it could muster. Blakesley's voice came over the radio. Bogies 11 o'clock high, 20 plus. Bogies 1 o'clock level, 20 plus. Total 50 and climbing. His pilots confirmed the Germans were assembling for a massive coordinated strike. At 9:58, the first German fighters dove in. "Here they come, break left and engage," Blakesley ordered. The 4th fighter group wheeled into combat. What followed was 7 minutes of chaos and violence in the sky. Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds and Focke-Wulf FW 190 seconds tried to break through the protective screen, only to be met by Mustangs turning sharply inside their attack angles, firing short bursts of tracers, forcing them to peel off or die.